Hi, everyone. It's Robert Levis. This is
Jason Thornton.
He is a preacher, pastor, minister, Church of Christ. We call it things, lots of different things. Where do you serve and preach at?
Tulsa, Oklahoma, at Memorial Drive, Church of Christ.
There you go. I've known Jason for 20-ish years. Mm-hmm. He didn't always like me. I'm not really sure he does today, but
I do now.
There you go. And as I've got to have a lot of different people this weekend, and Jason, thank you, first off, brother. Sure. He's going to spend us a few minutes talking about the Bible. Remember the whole context, 10 minutes a day. Open your word. This is a love letter. I had someone ask me, and it's funny, Jason, I had someone ask me yesterday, well, why? Because we're slowly going. Why don't you just skip stuff and get the point out? And the idea is, this is a love letter, right? Remember AIM, like you get that, we weren't supposed to date name. At least I weren't. I don't know if you were allowed to.
We were allowed to.
Oh, loser. Okay. Yeah. Well, I wasn't dating, but my wife, now wife, wrote me a letter. I read every word. And she wrote some Japanese on the back, and then I freaked out. I was in Scotland. I couldn't read it. But I wrote every word because that's a love letter, and that's the point. So we're going to get to a hard part of the love letter, because we use this, and we're talking about the Beatitudes, the understanding of the idea it's happy attitudes, right? This is the attitude that would produce out of it. And some of it was tough, and we talked about poor in the spirit, and those who mourn, and who are meek, and those who are hungry. These are hard words, but then it gets a little harder. And I wanted your perspective. This is kind of off the cuff and no prep, and thank you for doing this, because you're heading out to go preach tomorrow. So I'm going to read this to you, and just glean for me and for the three people, maybe two, if my mom's not watching, who will kind of get in their word and see this, and some tough stuff, maybe help us understand it more. Will you do that for me?
Sure.
All right, here we go. So this is what it is. This is Matthew 5, 17 and following. It says, "Do not think," and this is Jesus speaking, "that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And the verse 20 is a verse that we've linchpinned this on to. Man, I can't be that holy. It goes with this final verse. "For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And then we're getting some more detail, but that's a lot of words there. What's a few moment insight on that? How do you eat that?
Yeah, so kind of my first view of this for a long time was exactly what you're saying. This is impossible. Because as soon as I master one law, it opens up the fact I'm not doing two more well. It's weird. It's never ending, Yeah. So then I have to ask myself the question, what was the point of the law and the prophets? And Paul will write later in Galatians, I think it's 3, that the law was written to lead us to Jesus. Meaning, and by that, to show you can't. Matter of fact, I've heard it said, and I really agree with this, the whole of the Sermon on the Mount is to show, because he's speaking to people that thought if they could just do one thing better, then they would get it. And so he's saying the futility in that, because eventually he gets to, you've heard it said this, don't kill. I'm telling you, don't even call them names.
Yeah.
So the level he's saying is you can't do it, you can't do it. It's like Terry Rush once said, it's like God's having the whole world stand up and say, sit down as soon as you can't. And then he gets to the end of 6 and he's like, oh, if you're still standing, be holy just like God.
Yeah, just to make clear.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so back in this, what he's saying is, if the purpose of the law and the prophets was to say, you need a Savior, desperately, you need Jesus. He's saying, I'm fulfilling all of that message. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't useful application of the laws in context, specifically dietary laws and things like that, very specific. The way that they needed to have sanctuary cities, or the way that they needed to think through when somebody kills your oxen. Those are very practical applications. But at the end of the day, none of those will save you. Even if you could do them all, they wouldn't save you. you know? And so the thrust of the law was coming to Jesus, and see what they would hear is they'd hear Jesus say something, say, wait a minute, that's different than what the law said. And he's saying, your surface thinking about the law. I'm saying what that law was pointing to was your need for a Savior. And the righteousness, so 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made him who had no sin to become righteousness for us. Mm-hmm. That idea of surpassing the Pharisees' righteousness, the way I think about it, the equation is, if righteousness equals me doing progressively more right things, which was the Pharisees' model, yeah, I'm the least in the kingdom because there is no amount of right things I can do to become perfect. Only accepting his righteousness. And the whole thrust, again, if I'm right, if the whole thrust of the Sermon on the Mount is, do you see how much you need me? It starts with, you have nothing to offer, poor in spirit, and it ends with, build on my teaching or your whole house will fall down. And so he's saying, this is the nature of what I'm doing. So I'm taking all that the law and the prophets spoke to, and they spoke to very specific situations, but the overall thrust is, trust God. You know, trust God. Even the dietary stuff, the reason he had to tell them is because they wouldn't have done it. And so they had to trust God not to do it. It's like the manna, you know, that it's like, don't collect for the next day. And he had to make it maggot filled or else they still would have eaten it.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. But it was all, will you trust me? And so that's how that makes sense to me and fits with all the other passages.
So we were talking yesterday, he's a pillar knocker. I mean, he's knocking down these anchor pillars because, to me, so we grew up in the growing the church. Pharisee was almost a joke. It was like a list of a bad guy, right. And maybe even in the Church of Christ, like saying the Pope would be it's almost a joke.
Yeah.
But in reality, to a Catholic, that's like wow, Mother Teresa.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he's saying you've got to be more righteous than Mother Teresa, and to say. And that's such a paradigmal shift because we live in a world where we do, I mean, you're a preacher, that's an honor. I'm honored to be able to do that. And God's saying, no, that's not it. You cannot attain the righteousness.
That's right.
Which is hard part in your ministry because as you're preaching, you're saying, you're trying to say what Paul says, right? Follow me as I follow Christ.
Right.
But Paul's statement even at the end of his life is, I'm the wretch, I'm the worst of all sinners. And it's that understanding that my righteousness does not attain from my work.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's where that's crystal clear to me is, because it's so counterintuitive, Jesus is prepping these disciples, and he sends out 12 in Luke chapter 9, and they come back, and he sends out 72. And obviously what I'm thinking is, he's starting a movement, you know? So next is going to be 500, and then 1,000, you know?
Yeah.
So they come back, and he preps them so terribly. He's like, hey, here's my pep talk. You're a sheep, they're wolves. Take nothing that would make you feel secure.
Good luck.
Yeah.
A second coat?
Nah.
Yeah,
exactly. Don't take anything extra. So they come back and they're thrilled because they're casting out demons. I mean, how much more spiritual?
Oh, yeah, it's a revival moment.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
And he says basically the way I read that, I saw Satan fall like heaven. He's like, I get it. Stop rejoicing. And I'm like, what about that? Rejoice with those who rejoice. And he realized there was a greater danger. And that he's like, if you're not careful, you're going to, bam, we're a success. Mm-hmm. And he's saying, I want you to rejoice in the thing you had before. Your name is written in heaven. It's completely counter that your performance says you're a disciple. No, your relationship says you're a disciple. Your posture of, I want to learn from you because this is the nature of my humanity. When I have any success, I start putting pressure on myself to make the next thing work. And God says, hey, you can only have one master, and I'm giving you free will, so you go be with you as your master for a while, but you only have the resources of the master you serve. And when you run to the end of yourself, then come back.
Wow.
And we'll start all over.
Thank you, brother. We only have 10 minutes. I'm trying to say that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I pray for your ministry, the work. If you guys don't know, pray for Tulsa. They're struggling with a fire that happened there and a loss that happened there. But I thank you. And guys, get in your word daily. That's what it is. And I love the idea that if it's that master, it's not yourself, it's not your work. This is the